thought he swallowed it, but it had put a hole in his esophagus, and then he died. And I'm like, oh shit! Don't tell me that. You're gonna put my. Because of the fish. Yeah, where's my beer? No, I'm just kidding. Oh, glass. First they dress me, then they pour me drinks. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to keynote number 2. This is the keynote between the day's conference program and the free beer, which is going to be served afterwards, and also some soft drinks and also some snacks, of course. Before we start, let me just announce one little thing. Now I'd like to. Could you just give the next slide, please? Here's going. We also live stream our keynotes here, and in case if you want to inform your mother, your father, your uncle, and your dad, here's the bit.ly link for the exact live stream. The second, it's 20Z. We weren't quite sure if it's a 0 or O, so we had to copy and paste it to another editor. You can know the game, yeah? But it's an O, yeah? I can confirm it. If you want to share this link with somebody, this is an O. Please make a photo together with me. Okay, that's it. And now I'm really happy to announce our keynote number 2 of the conference and of the day. It's about DDD. Who knows what DDD means? Domain-driven design. Thank you very much. Okay, it's about a metamorphosis from the database-driven software development to DDD. And the interesting thing is, Julie, the keynote speaker, we just had a conversation. She's more than 30 years developer, and well, she's coming from the data access world, and then 10 years ago she moved more to the DDD world. That's what she told me. So it's about the metamorphosis in the sense of how to design your systems, but it's also about the metamorphosis what you can take as a developer in the software development area. Please give a warm hand to Julie Lerman.
Good job. So wait, you had to come watch me before you're allowed to have your beer? Well, it's only a half an hour. So, so yeah, I'm Julie Lerman. I have to stand away from these speakers. I think they're awfully loud. And is anybody familiar with the kind of most famous book, I think, German book? And good coincidence that it's called Metamorphosis. So that's what I'll be talking about. And there's, hello? Slides. Uh-oh. That's not good. Well, maybe it's better for you because it means I can't wander. But I like to wander. No, something is... This was working before. Is it because of the presentation mode?
You just take it one from Sebastian. It's the wrong one.
Oh, you... Like, what is going on there?
No, it's not. Sorry.
Okay, somebody go get me a beer. Red, green. It's buzzing.
That one works.
This one? Yeah, that one's mine. It's got the heart on it.
But there is. Almost empty.
Oh, okay. I lose things, so I put this heart on mine so I knew, because we all have the same ones. So there's all kinds of metamorphoses, these beautiful, beautiful metamorphoses in nature. There's metamorphosis in ancient literature. Has anybody read this ever? The Metamorphoses? I read them in college. They were pretty fascinating. And of course, in modern literature. But luckily, I did not go through the same kind of metamorphosis as Gregor Samsa did. It was a different kind of metamorphosis. And I don't know if anybody recognizes that book that my stand-in is holding, but it is the original domain-driven design book by Eric Evans, which came out, oh my gosh, not in 2013. That is a typo, kind of like your 0 and your O, except it came out in 2003. It's been around for 15 years. I've been programming a lot longer than that, and I didn't really discover this right away, but when I finally came into learning about domain-driven design, it really changed my life. Now here, I had been already programming for over 20 years, and I found something that completely changed my perspective on how to approach software design, how to interact with clients and involve them in the software process. Like, really changed, especially because I'd always been focused on the data. Right? I started programming in the 80s when I was 5. And yeah, okay, so you guys, you're screwed either way, right? I'm waiting for the laugh because it's a joke, but if you laugh, it's kind of rude. Take your pick. It's like being married, right? It's just a no-win situation there. But I came up with doing forms over data. DBase 4. Has anybody heard of DBase? Oh, wait, DBase 3. Right? Wait, we're going to get to, all right, you're somebody who's about as old as I am. So, yeah, where you really start, DBase stands for database, right? You started with the data. You focused on building data structures, and then you put forms on top of it, right? And then I did FoxPro, Access, Visual Basic, right? All forms, well, Visual Basic was my kind of a coding transition, but I still had that mindset. And I've been on the Microsoft stack for, all these years, speaking at a JavaScript conference, but, some of you were in my talk today. I had, Node and JavaScript code. But I have been on the Microsoft programming track. So, I moved into VB and then .NET, and now we're in .NET Core. So even as I came into .NET, I was still focused on the data, right? The data came first. I was solving the business problems with data and not really solving the business problems by focusing on the business problems, right? And it literally, so last century, right? I was doing in the 80s and the 90s. So eventually, I made this transition or this metamorphosis to a totally different focus. But there was a path to that. It started out, who here has done .NET programming, is in the .NET stack at all? Not very many at all. So Microsoft came out with, well, Microsoft started evolving its own object relational mapper, an ORM, and it never made it to, it never even got released. And then they tried another one, and it never got released. And then they tried another one, and I was invited to come and see it. And it ended up being released. And what was kind of funny was everybody else said, oh, come on, they've already tried it 2 times. It's not going to be reality. But I thought it was kind of cool. I'd never used an ORM before, and I've always been interested in data access. And not a database expert, not a DBA, but really getting data in and out of your applications. So when it got released, I suddenly became the worldwide expert of it because everybody else had ignored it. So it was kind of by default. But I was like the flag bearer. Everybody, thought of Entity Framework, they thought of me. And then there was another group of .NET programmers who were really doing a lot of agile stuff. And the original version of Entity Framework was really just did not lend itself to any kind of agile development. And so they called themselves alt.NET. And they were really mad about what Microsoft was doing with the Entity Framework in this first version. And so they went after me, right? Because I'm like, oh, the Entity Framework person. But instead of like going and hiding or being mad, I kept thinking, these are a lot of really, really smart people. And they're this passionate about their way, this agile development, their way of programming. And it made me curious, like, what is it? So then the next version of Entity Framework came out, and it supported POCOs, right? So I went back to all these alt.NET people and said, okay, this is the thing, you said we had to have POCOs. So tell me about, can you show me now how to use Entity Framework with POCOs now that it supports them, because this is what you wanted. And they all said, we're not touching that. We're not using Entity Framework. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'll have to figure it out myself. So then I started focusing on POCOs. I'm sorry, POCOs, plain old. Well, POCOs started out as in the .NET world as plain old CLR objects, which came from POJOs, plain old Java objects. And it's about the objects being not related to the data. The objects didn't have anything about the data access, right? They were just about the business logic of the objects. So this was really new to me, right? Having the idea of having a class that had some related data, I would normally maybe have a method in that class that went to the database to go get the data. So there was a big line drawn, right? Like I couldn't do that anymore. And it was really interesting to start thinking about these things separately, the data access and the business logic, because a lot of side effects and a lot of complications started melting away when I started putting things in different buckets. I'm sure people have experienced that with some technology or even, in life, right? I actually, a lot of the things I've learned in domain-driven design, I can apply to life now, which is kind of interesting. So POCOs were another step on my path. Then I started doing automated testing. I didn't do TDD right away. I did I guess you call it tests after development, TAD. But it was, that's okay because it still got me to understand the concepts of automated testing. And then eventually I was able, also to apply TDD. So there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it was just another step of, thinking in terms of having smaller units of logic that you could test, right? So really more breaking things down even smaller and smaller. And the more I was breaking things down into smaller units, whether it's for testing or I'm doing it because I'm removing the data access logic from my POCOs, it was, again, the side effects and the complications were starting to melt away. And it was, very noticeable to me after all these years of programming. And then finally, I discovered Eric's book, which had already been around for, I would say, about 7 or 8 years. And I came to it kind of on a funny path. I was watching a QCon interview with a highly respected architect in the .NET world. And he was talking about entity framework, so I was curious what his perspective was. And then at the end, they asked him, what's your favorite book? And he said, Eric Evans' Domain-Driven Design. It's like poetry. And I was writing my first book, my first technical book for O'Reilly, which was on entity framework. But I was like, poetry? What is it like to write a software book that's like poetry? That's why I picked the book up, just because of that. And the first thing I started reading, Eric was talking about, he wasn't talking about programming, he was talking about collaboration with your clients. And that so spoke to me because that's always been my favorite thing. Well, nothing's my favorite thing about programming. I love all the different pieces, but that was something that I love so much, working with clients, understanding their business, understanding their problems, making sure they understand their sometimes they need some help understanding their problems from a different perspective. So that was really how I evolved to that book. Now, there was a lot more to DDD than just client collaboration, but it's a really important piece of it because you have to understand their problems, you have to understand their world and understand their domain. So the domain-driven design, it's really all about that domain, and not just the whole domain, but the core domain. So there's really two pieces, two important things I wanted to be able to share with you today. One is this idea that you can really transform. You can, I've been programming for 30 years. I am still so excited about it, so excited about sharing what I'm learning with people, and really looking forward to learning new things, whether it's, a coding technique or, this is big picture thinking, right? Like domain-driven design. So that's part of what I want to talk to you about, but also, so what is it about domain-driven design that had this amazing impact on my outlook on the whole software building process? So I want to talk to you also about that. So one of the first things for me that was really impactful as I was focusing more and more on the domain, the data access and the data persistence, which was always my focus, started becoming more like a cross-cutting concern, like perhaps security. And I've joked that there are, maybe if you're building the next Dropbox, okay, then the data persistence is probably your core domain, right? But when in most cases, it's really about the business logic, and persisting that data and getting the data back really is a secondary concern. So some of the really, really big things with domain-driven design, they all have the word domain in them, right? You're working with the domain experts. You're working closely. You don't just go in and, say it's like a dentist office, right? And go, oh, I've been going to the dentist every 6 months for the last 40 years. I know how this works. I'll come back, in a couple months with some software for you, right? It just doesn't work that way. And then you're modeling the domain. You're going to build a model of the domain. And what you're doing is you're solving problems of the domain. And a lot of times people will say, well, what do you mean when you say the domain? And it's really about the business, right? What is the core of that business? What's their moneymaker? Another important piece of domain-driven design is it gives you the ability to solve the big messy problems, because instead of having them at you like this, we break them down into small solvable problems. And I do this a lot when I'm working with clients, when I can see them thinking, we're talking about one particular problem, but a lot of these problems are connected, right? And they're like, but then if we do this, then what about that? And then what about this? And we can see their stress level rising and rising. And I tell them, it's okay. Let's don't even think about those things. Let's just focus on this one, because we can see what this problem is. Let's just solve this problem. And and it's hard to say, and don't worry about the other problems. But what I'm able to say is, we've been solving how to connect those problems. The solutions exist about how to connect those problems, how to deal with relationships one, if you're going to focus on one problem here and then leave this other problem for another time, we already have guidance and solutions that people have been using for years to figure out how to get from here to there. So don't worry about it, right? I mean, I do that when I'm washing the dishes, right? Like, but the counters are messy, but the dog's barking. Like, all right, one thing at a time, right? It helps me a lot. So I've mentioned a few times client collaboration, how critical it is. And it does not bother me to just keep repeating that, because I think a lot of people, a lot of software developers might be a little more introverted, right? So maybe some of that collaboration is a little more difficult. But there are some really, besides Eric's book, the DDD book, there are other DDD books, and they actually walk you through, these conversations and people who've had experience doing this. So there's definitely some psychology involved also. So this is really important because a lot of times, another big concept in DDD, DDD is big, right? And again, my way of approaching DDD is learning kind of one thing at a time. And there's two big pillars in DDD. One is strategic design and one is tactical design. And there's a lot of debates in the DDD community about, DDD light if you're doing one and not the other, right? And, why do projects not succeed? Because, you're ignoring the strategic design and focusing on the tactical. So they're both critical. What are strategic and tactical design? So this is, right, who has the ability to learn all of these concepts at once? But this is kind of like the big picture of how DDD works. And don't worry about that. I just want you to see that it's a big picture. And, and it's tactical design is part of it. This is not showing some of the highlight to make it a little easier to see, but right about that middle where the ubiquitous language is, just about everything above it is tactical design and everything below it is strategic design. So the strategic design is about, this is, really important part of the client collaboration, analyzing the business problem, modeling the business problem, and strategizing, right? And working with the clients, because you can bring some of those strategies to them, but they bring the understanding of the business, understanding of the domain. And some of those strategies are identifying what is the core thing in your domain. That's, the core domain is really what you want to focus on. And then there's, things that you can solve with third-party software or APIs, or there's other subdomains, but the subdomains are not quite as critical as the core domain. So understanding that and kind of mapping all that out is really, really important. So core domain is the key in strategic design. And it leads you to creating these bounded contexts. And the bounded contexts are, if I go back to that cell diagram, bounded contexts are those individual problems that you want to solve. And what's important about the word bounded is that you put real boundaries around them. And the analogy of the cells is really interesting because the cells don't communicate with each other directly, but they use these, there are, the membranes have the logic of how, and the logic and the rules of how those can interact. Right, so for example, I'm sure a lot of you have heard leaky abstractions, right? So, that would be really bad if things were leaking in your cells, right? So logic from one depending on logic of another. So we would have some kind of API or a service in between that knows how to communicate, like a translator that knows how to communicate with both of them, rather than teaching them how to communicate with each other, because now you've added complexity, right, when you're starting to put logic of one inside the logic of the other. So the bounded context is really important. Within a bounded context, we have something that's referred to as ubiquitous language. So once you've identified these different context. You know, you're going to focus on one, and then you're going to have language or almost a glossary that is just about what's going on in there. And you might have different language and different glossaries for the other bounded contexts. So the language itself, the ubiquitous language, which is ubiquitous throughout the bounded context, from your conversations with the clients, from modeling, and actually down into actually coding, actually writing the code and designing the classes. You use that terminology. So you don't ever have to say, you know, you're talking to somebody about the code, whether it's one of the domain experts from the client or another person on the team, looking at some code and saying, you know, well, what's this class or what's this method? Oh, it's that, right? Something you've defined elsewhere. So instead, you just use the same terminology throughout the bounded context, but you don't have to worry about how that works in a different bounded context. Like the word client can mean different things depending on what you're working in, or the word customer, or the concept of what we might use the word customer all the way through when we're talking about sales and we're talking about shipping and we're talking about accounting. But actually, when you're talking about shipping, is it really a customer or is it really an address, right? When you're talking about accounting, is it really still a customer or is it an account, even if it has some of the same properties? So there's some really important things, but then you end up with these bounded contexts where you're designing them individually, right? You're solving that problem and you're not worrying about the problems in the other. We even have, you know, the idea of duplication was really, really hard for me to let go of. Like, you know, I want to just have one table, right, or one class that I use all over the place because the definitions are the same. But by having them in their own bounded context, then we can have, we can change things in one place without having bad side effects in the other bounded context. So those were really hard for me as a database focused person. Tactical design really is about the implementation, right? Bringing structure to that ubiquitous language, writing your classes. And tactical design, there's a number of things involved in here, but the ones that are the real biggies are entities, and, you know, this is like your basic classes that you use, entities, value objects, and aggregates, okay? An entity is an object that has a unique identity, whereas a value object is another class, but it doesn't have its own identity like a unique key or a primary key from a database. Instead, it's completely defined by the combination of all of its values, of all its properties, right? And that's, it took me, and I'm not going to try to explain it to you, it took me hearing 5 different explanations from 5 different people over many months before I finally had my aha moment about value objects. So don't freak out about them, but they are actually a really, really important idea in modeling. And again, they're another very, very important way to, again, reduce complexity, right? Something that by taking away its identity, all of a sudden it just becomes a property, right? Another property of another entity. Aggregates, you know, everything you're working with in a transaction becomes an aggregate, like a graph. And then there's one important leader in an aggregate, we call it the aggregate root, and it's in charge of all of everything else in its transaction, right? And I don't mean like a data persistence transaction, but I mean like if you have, you know, a set of children, the aggregate root is in charge of how those children come into the graph and how they're deleted or if they can be edited or anything like that. So another important thing that we're able to do in the tactical design is start minimizing the side effects that a really big problem area is the side effects that relationships create in our models. So one of the things that really helped me a lot when I finally understood this concept was to default to one-way relationships instead of defining navigations on both ends, right? So it's just, you know, I'm just going to feed these to you. I'm not going to give you the deep in, especially with 2 minutes left, deep understanding, but I just want to make sure you've seen these. And another, with these value objects, a lot of times we have one-to-one relationships, and those are really difficult sometimes to maintain, especially when we're talking about data persistence. But a lot of times as you learn more about value objects, you can see that more often what you think of as a one-to-one relationship is going to be better represented as a value object. So these were really huge concepts for me. So one of the problems that people do or perceive and actually act on when they're doing DDD is they try to model everything with domain-driven design. And DDD is really about solving the complex problems, right? Sometimes you just have applications that are CRUD. There's just data in and data out. You don't have complexity there. So there's no need to add complexity. The whole idea here is to, de-stress, right? And make things simpler and make things less complex and stressful. So that's an important thing to be able to understand, to recognize where it's useful to apply these ideas and where it doesn't make sense. So you can teach an old dog new tricks, we say. I don't like to refer to myself as an old dog, though. Although that might be better than the beetle with my face on it. So don't be afraid of these big kinds of changes, but do discriminate. When I'm talking about these kind of changes, I'm talking about the big ideas, like domain-driven design overall is a very big idea about how to approach designing software. I'm not talking about the JavaScript flavor of the month, right? Like chasing every one of those. So, do embrace it, invite it, be aware of it. And that is my advice to you. And this is how I feel all the time. Well, you've met me, right? I'm a pretty happy person. Yeah, but, instead of just doing the same thing. And the amazing thing is, like I said earlier, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I'm still learning, and I'm still excited, and I'm still having so much fun. So now it's time for beer. Thank you so much. Whether you're all going to be DDD converts or just ready for some new change in your life or your world of software, thanks so much for having a listen.
Thanks, Julie, for those very nice and interesting insights into your metamorphosis, and for really, frankly speaking, that it's hard to change. On the other hand, what's what I also learned. Thank you so much, and now grab a beer.